Sephardi Voices, and of course the Consulate of Israel in Miami, Florida, Mississippi, Puerto Rico, Alabama. There you go. Welcome everyone. I want to begin by really just giving you a sense of what Sephardi Voices is about and what the evening is about. Sephardi Voices is a project that is similar to Spielberg's. What Spielberg did was he went out and collected, well, other people collected, 52,000 stories of Holocaust survivors. And when I went and looked at this more than a decade ago, what I found was that less than 100 of those stories were of Jews, Sephardi in particular, who were displaced, who went through the Holocaust in northern Africa under the Vichy government, in Libya under the Italians. There wasn't even one interview of an Iraqi Jew during the Farhud, this horrible pogrom in 1941. And what I began to realize was that the Sephardi, the Jews who lived in the Islamic world, were basically invisible. Because in 1948, 1 million Jews lived between the Atlantic Ocean and the Tigris-Euphrates, the Iraqi rivers, and let's say with Iran. 1948. By leaving aside Iran, by the late 1970s, about 20,000 Jews remained. Now, if one puts this in context, a country like Iraq was a country in which, under the first exile in 586 BCE, Jews had lived. It was where the Babylonian Talmud was written. So here you have this history of 2,500 years, and I've put on your chairs a little one-page summary of Sephardi Voices. And if you looked at that, you would see that there are only a handful of Jews left in Iraq. In fact, there's only 3 now. 1948, roughly 150,000. Or you take a country like Libya, which had 38,000 in 1948. Today, there is 0. And here is a civilization that, if you put it into perspective, in 1400, 90% of the Jewish world lived in the Islamic world. They did not live in Europe. So when they were kicked out of Britain in 1290, and the most famous English writer, Shakespeare, wrote in 1600, The Merchant of Venice, no Jew had lived in England for 300 years. So it is just unbelievable that 1 million people could be displaced, and no one talks about it. No one refers to it. No one sees them as victims. And what it is a human rights story. They lost their property, they lost assets. Many went through the same kinds of things that had happened during the Holocaust period in terms of decrees that said you're going to lose your citizenship, you're going to lose your rights, etc., etc. So Sephardi Voices is a project that, like Spielberg, what it does, it tries to document the life stories of Jews displaced from North Africa and the Middle East. It collects portraits. It takes the historical documents, the deeds, and scans them. And all this documentation is then being sent to the National Library of Israel in order to be then made accessible, put on a platform, streamed, and can be used by all kinds of people, policymakers, researchers, and it tells a very different story in terms of Zionism, in terms of the life of Jews in the Arab countries and in Islamic countries. And in countries like Canada, United States, or in Britain, those interviews that come from these countries are also going to be housed in those libraries. So in, for example, Britain, it's the British Library. In Canada, it'll be the National Library of Canada. The idea being that it's the government that then has these documents. So unlike Spielberg, where it goes from VHS to digitization, and you say to yourself, okay, how do you preserve this? It becomes the heritage of the country. And so Sephardi Voices, what it's really trying to do at its most basic level is saying the second generation, the children, the grandchildren, they're not going back to Iraq, they're not going back to Libya. How can we create pride? How can we nourish their legacy of Sephardi life? And their grandparents, the parents telling the stories, which become part of Sephardi Voices. We give them a USB, no cost, and they can share it with their families. It can be part of school systems. We build exhibits, try to make movies, etc. And at the meta-narrative, we're changing the story of Jewish life post-1948. It's not just an Ashkenaz European story. It's also a Sephardi story. And so I want to just give you a little brief taste of Sephardi Voices with a video.
We were attached to something that we, even without knowing it, we had lost.
On se sent jamais chez soi quand on est dépossédé de sa terre. J'aimerais bien pouvoir retourner, mais on sait qu'on ne pourra jamais retourner.
There is a lot in you that belongs to the past, and you have to go back there if you want to be what you are. You better look at that and see what you can get out.
I don't want my ancestors' achievements to end in my lifetime. I don't want me to be the last link in the chain.
But how can I deny that I'm an Iraqi? I didn't go there as an immigrant. I've been there for 3,000 years.
So that's a little taste of what we do, little pieces of the interviews from people who come from these many countries in North Africa and the Middle East. So I want to turn to Mr. Lior Hayat, who's the Consul General of Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and Puerto Rico. Got them all? Who is a sponsor of the event this evening. And he has had an amazing career. He's been the Department Director of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean Islands in the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem. He was the spokesperson and public diplomacy officer at the Embassy of Israel for Spain. He worked in the embassy in Argentina. But he also is a typical Israeli. He spent time as a captain and artillery coordinator in the infantry unit. He has a master's from the Hebrew University. And born and raised in Petah Tikva, half Sephardi, half Ashkenazi, which is 100% Israeli. Please welcome Mr. Hayat.
Thank you, Henry. Actually, when we started this event, I'm amazed I'm the only Sephardic voice that you'll hear tonight, if I remember correctly, right? Shalom, everyone. I'm Lior. I'm the Consul General of Israel in Miami. As Henry said, we are in charge of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Puerto Rico, the best part of the U.S., especially if you are an Israeli diplomat. And we are honored to be here and to partner with Henry and with the university. This is our third year in a row that we are celebrating or commemorating one of the most important events in order to understand the reality in the Middle East, which is the Yom Plitim, or the day that we commemorate the Jewish refugees from Arab countries. It's a special pleasure this evening because we have with us an old friend. Actually, we met, I think, over 30 years ago, if I remember correctly, over 35 years ago. And we studied together, we went on our own path, and then Adi Schwartz, who is here with us, is a journalist and investigator and one of the experts in Israel and in the world about on the case of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries. And when he agreed to come and to talk to us, I think it made a huge opportunity for us to connect those two dots: the Sephardic voices from one hand, and the story of how this phenomena of the Jewish refugees from our countries is still relevant for Israel today. Although it happened it started over 70 years ago, it happened towards the 1950s and most of the 1960s, but it's still an issue today. And it's an issue today because it's not the only case of refugees in the Middle East. And we are used to hear about Palestinian refugees. This is the narrative that is the dominant narrative in the last 70 years. And all of a sudden we understand that there are two sides for this coin, and we cannot talk about one without mentioning the other, and we should educate people about the entire story of refugees that were created, or this phenomenon of refugees that was created in the Middle East as a result of the creation of a Jewish state, the State of Israel. So let me invite to the stage Adi Schwartz, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the Jewish refugees from Arab countries. How is it relevant for us today?
Okay, thank you. Should I speak with you? Okay. Hi, good evening. I'm happy to be here, happy and honored. First of all, I'd like to thank the consulate and Lior, University of Miami, and Sephardi Voices. So as Henry just said before, there were about 1 million Jews living in Arab countries in 1947, and today there are almost none. There's no Jews in those countries. And that's quite an extraordinary phenomenon if you think of the Jewish diaspora. Even in very anti-Semitic countries, or in countries that had very tough experiences, such as Russia with its Tsarist Russia heritage, or Germany with its Nazi heritage, you still have Jewish communities today. But in the wider Arab world, you will not find Jewish communities today. So the question is why? Why this disappearance? Why an entire civilization has simply evaporated? So in order to answer this question, we should divide those Jewish communities in two separate sets of countries. The first set of countries are the countries which encircle Israel. So I'm talking about Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Yemen to a certain extent. So in these cases, the trigger, the most important date to know is 1948, but perhaps even before, the partition plan, the point where the United Nations accepted a petition to make two countries, a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine, or the land of Israel, the Holy Land, as you wish to call it. And in fact, what happened at that stage is that the entire Arab world, including the Palestinians, decided to attack the state of Israel. So they rejected the partition plan and they decided to attack Israel. At the same time, they decided to attack the Jewish citizens. So right after 29th of November, which is the date when the partition plan was accepted at the United Nations, Jewish communities were being attacked in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq. So in parallel to the attack that all those countries had against the state of Israel, they also attacked their citizens, their Jewish citizens. Why? Did the Jewish citizens do anything to deserve that? Did the Jews attack the countries? Not at all. They were accused of being Zionists or agents, communists, whatever, but in fact they were simply Jews. So it is seen as enemies of those states. Their assets were frozen, their bank accounts were frozen, they were sacked from their jobs. Some of them were arrested, beaten, tortured. We have even cases of bombs thrown into Jewish markets, Jewish shops, Jewish synagogues. And at the end of the day, in those countries, especially Egypt, Iraq, Syria, in a very short time, if you walk in those countries in 1950, 1951, you already have those countries simply empty of Jews. So reality becomes simply impossible for Jews to continue living in those countries, and they leave. Some of them are physically being expelled, being taken to ports with just one suitcase, $20, $100. They cannot take any of their assets, their furniture, their belongings, And we are talking, as Henry just mentioned, about communities who were there much before the Arabs were there, much before Islam was there. In Iraq, in Babylonian community, we know that Jews are in Babylonia from the 6th century BC. In Yemen, we know of Jewish communities from the 1st century AD. In Morocco as well, we know about Jewish communities in the North African shore from Roman times. That's 500 years before Muhammad went up from the Arab Peninsula and conquered the entire area. So those Jewish communities of 2,000 years had to leave everything behind and to flee. There's another group of countries, and that's the group of countries which are in North Africa, where the situation is a little bit different. We're talking about Morocco, about Algeria, Tunisia. By the way, the numbers, Iraq was a very large community of 150,000, Egypt around 100,000, and Syria is a little bit smaller. In North Africa, we're talking about Morocco with 250,000, Algeria 150,000, Tunisia 100,000. Libya is a separate case because it's in North Africa, but it's resembling more to the case of those countries who the Jewish communities live in 48. What's happening in North Africa? The situation there is a bit different. We see that even after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, there's a trickle of Jews living those countries, but not a lot. When you look at the numbers...
Use this mic.
Okay, use this mic. When you look at the numbers, the Jews who are leaving Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, you see a very small number of Jews living them in 48, 49, 50. That's already after the creation of the State of Israel. When do you see a massive exodus of Jews from these countries? So in the case of Morocco, for example, 55, 56, and then again in the beginning of the 60s. In Algeria, you see an entire Jewish community of 100,000 Jews living Algeria in 1 year, 61, 62. So what's happening here? It's not the creation of the State of Israel. If it's 56, 61, 62, the important date is not the creation of the State of Israel. The important date in this case is that the French are leaving North Africa. 1956 is the year when Morocco gets its independence. Algeria, of course, with the War of Independence, 1962 is the relevant year. So the question is, what's happening? Why is it that when the French are leaving North Africa and these states become independent Muslim Arab countries, why is it that the Jews decide that they have to flee? What do they know that makes them, that makes them want to leave these countries? So in order to better understand the reason, we have to go back a little bit and understand the history, historical relationship between Jews and Muslims. So they have a history. Judaism and Islam have a history, have a relationship between these two, which go back to the age of Muhammad, to the 7th century AD. So historically, the status of Jews under Islam is a status which is called dhimmi. What does dhimmi mean? Dhimmi means that under Muslim rule, Muhammad, when he left the Arab Peninsula and took control of all these areas of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, some of Europe, he decided that people who already believe in one God, remember that by the 7th century we already had Christianity, we already had Judaism, so he decided that people who already believe in one God, their lives can be spared. So you don't have to kill the Jews, you don't have to kill the Christians, you can let them stay and live under Muslim rule, but in return they have to accept their inferior status. So it means that they will have some kind of a local autonomy. They can keep on, for example, eating kosher food, they can keep on marrying according to Jewish law, they can bury their dead by Jewish law, but they must remember that politically speaking, Muslim lands are for the Muslims. So you cannot have, for example, a Jewish ruler in a Muslim land. Jews and Christians, by the way, are inferior in their legal and social status. Now, what does it mean? Beginning in the 7th century, you had a series of rules, which, for example, we all know the ghettos, and we know the yellow badge that was very famous later on, but this is a Muslim invention. The point was simply to make a distinction between Jews and between Muslims. Jews could not have weapons with them, and that is something which is very important. Remember, it's not the 21st century. We're talking about the 7th century, and we're talking about being insecure when you travel, for example. So the fact that Jews could not wear weapons with them was very important. Jews, for example, cannot ride horses, only donkeys, because a horse is a noble animal which only Muslims can use, etc., etc. There are a lot of rules here that the point was to make the Jews be inferior. Perhaps the most important aspect was a special tax, which was called jizya, that the Jews had to pay, with the specific condition or the specific requirement from the Muslim ruler in the Quran to humiliate the Jew when he pays it. So even by stepping on his head or doing anything which is very symbolic to make the Jews be in an inferior position. Now the question is, were all these rules, were they always implemented in the same way? No. The answer would be no. We are talking about 1,000 years in an area from Morocco to Iraq. Of course, there's special circumstances in any such case. But the important thing to understand that in the Muslim psyche, in the Muslim understanding of the world, in the Muslim notions of justice, in the Muslim notions of how the world works, there is no such thing as equality between a Muslim and a Jew. A Jew is always less than a Muslim. Okay? So that's, even if there was difference in terms of how it was implemented, that's the basic notion. An interesting thing happens when, perhaps even before, there always a question of, so which is worse? Is Christian Western anti-Semitism worse than Muslim, historical, classical attitudes towards Jews? So it's very different. The Christian point of view is much more involved with hatred. And if you want to understand it very simply, you should go back to the basics, because the difference between how Christians see Jews and how Muslims see Jews is the difference between Jesus and Muhammad, or between Jesus' life and Muhammad's life. Remember that in the eyes of the Christians, the Jews basically killed God, or at least God's son, right? They are supposedly guilty of killing God, and that's a very heavy burden to live with, and therefore Christian Western anti-Semitism was always involved in real hatred. So it's something which is devilish or demonic. The view of the Jew is very demonic. Whereas the situation of Muhammad and the Jews is very different. When Muhammad met the Jews, in the Arab Peninsula, he won. There was a combat between the Muslims and the Jews, and Muhammad won. So how angry can you be at someone who you defeated in battle? So in the eyes of the Muslims, the Jews are not the killers of God. They're simply losers or people who God left, right? Because the new treaty with God is with the Muslims. So it's a different kind of attitude. It's not so much of hatred, but more of contempt, being worth less. So it's a difference. An interesting thing happens when Europeans enter the Middle East. So when Napoleon reaches the shores of Egypt in the end of the 18th century, he brings with him already the winds of the French Revolution, with the ideas of freedom, of equality. Remember that one of the things that the French Revolution did was to emancipate the Jews, to make them equal at least in legal terms. So when Napoleon reaches the Arab world, first the influence of the French and then the British conquer the entire area, they bring with them these notions of equality, of freedom, and it's impossible for them to accept that under Muslim rule, Jews are considered to be dhimmis. So they abolish, or at least they pressure the Turkish Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, to abolish the status of dhimmi. And that's exactly what's happening. The Sultan in Istanbul abolishes the status, the inferior status of the Jews in the middle of the 19th century, and in fact makes them equal. So all of a sudden, you see a very interesting phenomena, which is, by the way, quite similar to what's happening in Europe. In Europe, in Germany, in France, in many other countries, you start seeing Jews flourish. You start seeing Jews become part of normal society, so to speak. You start seeing them doctors, lawyers, participate, live in the cities. Some of them become diplomats. They become part of, let's say, normal society. Similar phenomena happens, for example, in Iraq later on in the 20th century, in Egypt from the mid-19th century. So slowly you see Jews in the large cities, in Baghdad, in Aleppo, in Cairo, in Alexandria, in Casablanca. You start seeing Jewish, very urban communities, speaking languages, for example, speaking French, a very strong French influence. They become more middle class. They become part of normal society. So everything is good, right? Everything seems like on a good path. The only problem is that it's a foreign influence who makes the Jew be equal. So how does a Muslim see all this happening? So it's not only that the Jews are now equal to a Muslim, everything here happened because of the English, because of the French. So it's not some kind of an internal evolution inside Muslim societies. In Europe, what happened is that Christian societies went through some kind of a process. There was some kind of evolution, the French Revolution, etc., the Enlightenment. All these factors helped the Jews become equal, at least, let's say, socially and legally. We know that in Europe, the end wasn't so, or at least it wasn't so bright. But in the Muslim world, what's happening is that it's not Muslim internal evolution. It is something that is being pressured from the outside. So it is perceived as an injustice. If justice is that the Muslim is here and the Jew is here, then this equality between Jews and Muslims is an injustice. And this injustice was done by the British and by the French. So the Jews are now being seen as traitors, being seen as collaborators with the English and the French. And remember, we're talking about people who were there before the Muslims, people who were there before the Arabs, okay? But all of a sudden, they are foreigners. So now, fast forward to 1956, right? In Morocco, to 1961 in Algeria. So now the French are leaving North Africa. And now we know that these nascent countries are going to declare themselves to be both Arab and Muslim. So what do these Jewish communities understand about their future? They understand very well that what's going to happen is that they are going back to be dhimmis. They are going back to be second-class citizens. So if you ask Jews who come from Morocco or Jews who come from Iraq, how is your life? What were the conditions of your lives? So some of them would say, we had a wonderful life. We were very rich. Everything was perfect. But this is somehow deceiving, because Morocco was French from 1912 to 1956. So when Jews tell their stories are under French rule. They do not know of being under Arab or Muslim rule. Same thing for Iraq. The first half of the 20th century, Iraq was under British rule. So saying that life was good in 1920 for an Iraqi Jewish family is not saying too much, because it's basically an English-ruled Iraq. So the Jews of Morocco decide to leave in 1956, and the Jews of Algeria decide to leave in 1961. And as we said before, by the mid-60s, this entire region becomes simply empty of Jews. Now the question is, or a few questions, what can we learn from all this? You can hear sometimes, basically it's in Arab propaganda, that everything was perfect. There was harmony. Basically, Zionism is a European invention. Everything was peaceful here, harmonious. Muslims treat Jews perfectly. Yes, of course, we acknowledge that European Jews had some problems. European Jews had to face anti-Semitism in Europe. But this is foreign. This is not something which is local to the Middle East. We never had, this is a Palestinian or Arab narrative. We never had any problem with the Jews. Jews and Muslims can live together. We don't need Zionism. We don't need Ashkenazi Jews coming here and stirring everything, all the problems. See, Herzl was European, Ben Gurion was Russian. They brought here all their problems and they're trying to enforce a new worldview on the Middle East. So this is simply not true. There wasn't harmony between Jews and Muslims, or at least perhaps it was very happy and harmonious for the ruling class. Yes, perhaps Muslims were happy with that. I can understand that. But Jews weren't so happy. Bernard Lewis, for example, writes in his book, Jews of Islam, that as long as Jews played according to the rules, as long as they accepted their inferior place, yes, everything was okay. But all the cases where Jews tried to do something differently, were trying to step out of the rules a little bit, it ended very violently. There were pogroms in the Arab world and the Muslim world. There were kidnapping of girls, there was ransom, rape, everything you can imagine was also in the Muslim world. So in fact, there wasn't no harmony, and Jews in Arab and Muslim world lived under precarious circumstances different than those in Europe, but very precarious circumstances. So the conclusion is that Zionism is not the problem. Zionism is the solution. So the problems of the Jews in Arab countries began much before Theodor Herzl was even born. There are, for example, an abundance of descriptions of how Jews in the beginning of the 18th century, that's more than 50 years before Herzl was born, of Jews simply walking in the streets of Jerusalem or in Algeria or even in Istanbul, Constantinople, and Arab kids, Muslim kids throwing stones at them, beating them, kicking them, and the Jews cannot do anything because they're simply inferior to them. That was simply the rule, that if you are a Jew, you're helpless, you're under the protection of the Muslim rule, which means that when the ruler does not want to protect you, you're not protected. So the conclusion is that, again, Zionism is not the problem, but the solution. Actually, in my view, the way to look at Zionism is that it's a liberation movement of an indigenous people, right? Usually, Zionism in the State of Israel is being attacked as a foreign, colonialist, imperialist endeavor on the, creating independence with the British Army and today perhaps with some American support. But no, that's not true. There were Jews living in Jerusalem and in Aleppo and in Cairo and Alexandria. Were they supposed to live as minority to this day? When we look today at the Middle East, Syria, what's happening, Iraq, what do you think would be the fate of those Jewish communities if they were there until today? The upheaval in Syria or the civil conflict in Iraq, we see what's happening between Sunnis and Shias, or the Yazidis, what's going on, the Copts in Egypt. So being a religious minority in the Middle East is not a very promising phenomenon. In my view, actually, even if not one single Jew would come to Palestine, the Holy Land, State of Israel, from Europe, the Jews of Arab countries, the local, the indigenous Jews, had the right to create their own state. Even if Ben Gurion never came to the State of Israel and no Jew came from Odessa or Hamburg or Paris. You have 1 million people who are very distinct in their ethnicity, in their religion. They are indigenous. They certainly deserve the right for self-determination. If Iraq is a country, if Syria is a country, if Jordan is a country, is a state, then definitely the Jews can have their own state. So that is something which we must remember in today's climate, in today's relationship between Jews and Arabs. And in fact, in my view, this is a way forward. Because until the Arab world will not recognize this history, they will always see Zionism as a foreign endeavor. In order to accept Israel and the Jews really, I mean not only, from the mouth, but really seriously and deeply accept the Jews as sovereign in the Middle East, they must recognize and acknowledge the history of the Jews in those countries. Only if they recognize and acknowledge that history, I think it would be much easier to reach peace and understanding between Jews and Arabs. And with that, I'd like to suggest if you want to ask any questions, I'd be very happy to answer any questions. Don't be shy. Yes?
So I have a question. It looks like Morocco has the largest Jewish community. This was of 2012, but is that still the case today? And if so, what is life like for a Jew in Morocco today? I mean, are there synagogues that are still open? Is there any sense of Jewish community? Are there Jewish neighborhoods? Or can people be Jewish, act their Judaism out, or do people just hide it?
Jewish community today in Morocco. So there are a few thousand Jews living in Morocco, and to the best of our knowledge, of what we know, they live in a relatively good condition. They certainly do not hide their Jewishness. They can practice their Judaism. There are synagogues. It's a very small community. So saying anything substantial about 3,000 Jews would be a little bit too much. But bear in mind that always Jews could practice their religion. Generally speaking, Jews did not have a problem with just practicing their religion. As long as they were in their neighborhoods, doing their own thing, eating kosher food, that's good. They could not participate, and they cannot participate even today, in the political sphere, having some kind of a powerful position. That is the problem. The problem is that they are not equal in the sense of power, in the sense of politics, okay? So they can live there, they can practice their religion, but that's it. So that's a very typical pattern. So as long as they do not threaten anyone with their position, that's okay. I want to mention one more community which is interesting, and the community of Iran, the community of Persia, which is very interesting. First of all, an interesting feature is that the Shiites have a very different, more strict approach towards Jews. So if Sunni Muslims simply see Jews, they treat them in contempt, Shias are much more harsh because Shiites have this notion of impurity, which is absent from Sunni Muslims. And for example, when Ayatollah Khomeini came back to Iran in 1979 from France, he wrote a book, how to practice, now that I come back, and we have an Islamic republic, how you should conduct your businesses. And he had one chapter about impurity. And impurity, you should not touch someone who is impure. Someone who is impure can be killed, etc., etc. So the things which are impure and the devout Shiite Muslim must avoid are such stuff as urine and the Jew. So that's in his book. And I can tell you that I had stories. I'm giving these lectures in Israel where you can find still Jews who are, 70, 80, 90 years old, and they come to me and tell stories. So I'll tell you one from Iraq, which also has a very large Shiite population. And he was a boy going with his mother to the tomb of, I think, Yechezkel, which is buried in the prophet from the Bible, which was, his tomb is in Iraq. And they stopped somewhere in the road to have coffee or to eat something, and he was a boy. And he accidentally, or perhaps he wanted it, there was a man there selling grapes. It was like a big stall or whatever, how you call it, a kiosk or something, selling grapes, and he touched one of those grapes. He wanted to eat them. And obviously, when a Jew, a Jewish boy, touches a grape, it means that the entire place, he cannot sell it to other Muslims. So the vendor forced the mother to buy the entire place because he has nothing to do with it, because he can't sell it to any other. And she was a poor woman. She did not have money to buy all those grapes, and she had to go to the bus or the carriage or the coach from other Jews to raise that money, because otherwise she knew that her life and the boy's life would be in danger. So that's just a small story about the notion of being impure. If you touch a food, I mean, if you touch something, if you drink water, you might be dead because you did something which is against Shiite concept of impurity. Yes?
I was wondering why Jordan or Transjordan is missing from the state.
According to British rule, the British, when they separated the eastern part of Transjordan, they decided that no Jews can be in Jordan. So Jordan had never any Jewish population whatsoever. It's by British. It's a desert, basically. Nobody lived there. It's just nomads, Arab nomads traveling on camels. It was never a civilization, a strong civilization like Syria or Iraq. No Jews lived there. Yes, please.
Could you speak to the question or the history of Jews in Turkey?
Well, Jews in Turkey, specifically speaking, the pattern is very similar. But the differences, I would say, since most of those centuries, central government was in Istanbul, I'm talking about the Ottoman Empire, the situation of the Jews was actually a little bit better. Because in the Ottoman Empire, the more you were close to the center, the stronger the rule of the Sultan was. And when the Sultan was very strong, he could keep things, in order. The further you went in the empire, the worse situation of the Jews was. For example, Morocco, which people think sometimes the Jews lived very well, there was one of the worst places actually for a Jew to live, because it was very far from Ottoman rule, and there were warlords, constant situation of fighting, whereas in Istanbul you had relative order. It was very easy for the Sultan to keep order. But I can tell you that I read some stories of one story is that two gentlemen, that's already the 19th century, where you have Jews walking in suits and ties. I think there were two lawyers walking in a garden in Istanbul, and Muslim boys, small Muslim boys, throwing stones at them, and they can do nothing. That's a story coming from 19th century Istanbul. So it's relatively good in the sense that there's strong central rule, but again, it's a very precarious situation, so it can deteriorate very easily. And by the way, the entire concept of dhimmi means being under the protection of the ruler. So you understand that it is immediately connected to the situation of the ruler. When the ruler is weak, the protection is weak. When the ruler is strong, the protection is stronger. So it's a very delicate situation. You have to be very wise and conduct yourself in a very delicate situation. But generally speaking, it was in Turkey better, a little bit better than in other areas of the empire. Yes, please.
Assuming that conditions could get better and they can improve equality in Arab countries, do you know if there's any widespread desire for Sephardi communities to move back to their countries and replenish their communities?
I don't know of even one Sephardi Jew who lives in Israel who would like to go back to live in an Arab country. There are certainly people who would like to visit, and there are, by the way, especially in Morocco, because Israelis can now travel to Morocco. But I don't know of even one Israeli who really wants to go back there. And that's actually a very telling fact. I mean, the fact that nobody wants to go back, and by the way, the fact that 100% of the community left looks like not a voluntary phenomena. If it would be a voluntary, you would expect that at least some would stay. I mean, it's impossible that 100% decide to leave. Something's very bad going on there. So, no, the answer is no. Yes, please.
Was the story different when the Muslims ruled Spain?
There was a time when, in the books it's called the Golden Age, when Jews had relatively better lives. Yes, one should understand that even in those 1,000 years or 1,300 years, there were certainly better times. There were certainly some good times. Remember, for example, that Maimonides, right, lived his life entirely under Muslim rule. But that's also, we can go into that, but how did it end? So the question is, you had a period of very good, or at least decent life conditions, and you had Jews, successful Jews, who could lead perhaps fuller lives than usually. And again, the important thing is not only be able to practice your religion, because that normally was not the problem. The problem was gaining some kind of power, being part of the elite in terms of military, in terms of politics, and that you didn't have. And the only case that we do have is Shmuel HaNagid, for example, from the 11th century. You do not have a parallel in the Christian world. Shmuel HaNagid was, in the 11th century, Spain, who led armies. This is something that you do not have in the Christian world. You do not have a Jew who leads Christian armies, where you do have a Jew leading a Muslim armies. But the problem was exactly that when he died, there was such a backlash because exactly Jews deviated from their role. So all of a sudden you have a Jew who is important, who is a Wazir, who is an important minister, and then you have a backlash, and there's a terrible massacre, terrible pogrom of Jews right after Shmuel HaNagid. So yes, there are better times, but again, the situation is very precarious. The situation is very delicate, very volatile, and could change very quickly. Yes? Yes?
Beside the history of the Jews in our countries, and the fact that this history ends in a very short period of time, if you look at the Middle East today, how is the story of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries relevant to the role of the State of Israel in the Middle East, or the future of the State of Israel, the Middle East, and the connection between the State of Israel and the countries that those Jews came from?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that half of Israel's population is from the Middle East. So, whereas I think in North America and in Europe and in other parts of the world, Jews from Arab countries are not a significant number or a proportion. In the State of Israel, they are. Half of the State of Israel today is coming from the Middle East. So as I said before, I think that the role of the State of Israel is the role of a haven for them. It's the only place where they can live peacefully. It's the only place when they can not only practice their religion, but be full citizen, full parts of life, politics, military, judiciary, everything. They can do everything in the State of Israel. They're not second-class citizens. They're part of Israeli society, normal citizens. And that is the reason why I think the State of Israel is so important for Middle Eastern Jews as well. As I said before, I think that only a recognition of their role, of their history in the Arab world would make it much easier for the Arab countries to accept a Jewish state. There's one more thing I would like to add. Sometimes, and I think you mentioned it also in your introduction, There's a discussion about Jewish refugees and Arab refugees, Palestinian refugees. So it is true that in terms of numbers, the two phenomena seem like a parallel position. There's like 750,000, there were 750,000 Palestinian refugees. Today we have more than 5 million, but that's a separate issue. And there was something like 800 or 900,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. But the situation is very different. And this comparison is not entirely correct, because Jewish citizens and Jewish residents of those Arab countries didn't do anything to harm the Arab countries. Not here, in the state of Israel, you had a war where the Palestinians attacked the Jews, and therefore, as part of wars, usually that's what's happening. People are being killed, wounded, and have to leave their houses. So whereas Palestinians were a belligerent side, they attacked the Jews in the state of Israel, Jews who lived in Arab countries did no harm. They were simple victims in the sense of simply being kicked out of their houses or had to live lives which are unbearable. So there's a big difference between the two cases. Yes?
I am from Tunisia, and you ask if we want to go back. Yes, we love our country. We are very attached to our culture. We would have stayed in Tunisia, but we had to leave. We didn't have a choice, and it was we were there before that. That is to say, we were talking Arabic, the culture, the music, the country. And we would love to go back for vacation. Yes, my family would love to go back, but it's not safe.
You repeat the question?
She mentioned, she said that you were born in Tunisia? Yeah, she was born in Tunisia, and she answered the question. She said she would love to go back, but it's simply not safe. She said she liked the country, she had to leave, but it's simply not safe. I'd like to add before that in many of those countries, Iraq and Egypt are classic examples, Jews try to do everything possible to blend and to be part of even of the national movement. I'll give you a few examples. In Egypt, one of the first activists for a free Egypt from Ottoman and from British rule was a Jew. He was kicked out of Egypt because he was too nationalistic. The British had to expel him because he was too nationalistic. The same goes for Iraq. The first finance minister of Iraq was a Jew. Some of the people who wrote Iraqi constitution were Jews. And this is, by the way, something which is very similar to the situation in Germany, in Hungary, where German Jews and Hungarian Jews tried to be very nationalist, to build a new country. This is exactly what happened in Iraq, but it didn't work, because Iraqi nationalism at the end of the day was built on the notion of Arab and Muslim. And Jews were not Muslim, obviously, and again we went back to the notion of dhimmi, to the notion of the Jews are not part of the entire society. So Jews tried to do a lot of things. They tried to create a new Iraq, they tried to create a new Egypt. They really didn't want to leave their countries. I mean, most of them. There was always a Zionist movement. There was always a tendency to go back to Zion. But most people wanted to stay in their homes, and they couldn't do it anymore. Yes, please.
Maybe my...
Can you just raise your voice?
Yeah, maybe my question is out of this context, but I'm born and raised in Cuba. During my whole life over there, I didn't realize that the Jews, it was a really strong community over there. Just when I went to the university to study, I realized that some of my college has a last name of Cohen, Perez, or something like that. And later from my grandpa, I know that most of the famous cutter of diamond is coming from the Jewish community in Havana or something like that, long time ago. But at some point, I realized that it was synagogues in Havana, bunch of them, but I never saw like people from my generation going to over there, even they belong to the Jewish community. How healthy, in your opinion, is the Jewish community in Cuba, in Havana? How strong is actually the reality? And then I realized that most of the Jews on Cuba found a way to go back to Israel, trying to find a better, way of life.
You're asking how strong or what's the position of Jews in Cuba? That's
The healthy of the community, like community.
well, I really cannot say much about that. I'm not a specialist on that. I can't say any. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, go ahead.
As a matter of fact. Well, the Jewish community in Cuba used to be from tens of thousands Jews. Most of them came in the beginning of the 20th century and right after the Second World War. It was a community that was very, it was part of the Cuban community, mostly businessmen. Most of those Jews left Cuba with the first wave of immigration right after the revolution. I couldn't say that most of them left to Israel. Most of them are living here among us in Miami, also known as Cubans here, and we're talking about a very large Jewish community, or Cuban Jewish community in Miami. We have about 1,500 Jews living in Cuba today. I would say most of them are by choice. They are part of the Cuban society in everything that has to be with that. There was a huge change in Cuba regarding Judaism in the early 1990s, and even came to a point where, if I remember correctly, 22 years ago, in the holiday of Hanukkah, Fidel Castro visited the synagogue, the main synagogue of in Havana, also legitimizing the Jews in a way by visiting that community. It's a strange community because it's a growing community. There are a lot of Cubans converting into Judaism, mainly from economical point of view, because Jews receive kosher meat and kosher food directly from the communities, from the Jewish community in Mexico and Canada. So it's kind of a good thing in Cuba today to be a Jew, because you get more than the rest of the Cubans, because you get to eat meat every week. I think this is not something that most Cubans get on a weekly basis. It's a small community, but it's very much involved in the Cuban politics and ways of life. I think this is more or less, in 2 minutes, the history of the Jewish community in Cuba.
Okay. Yes. Other questions? Yes?
Maybe someone who's here would want to go back. But I was wondering, for everybody that is in Israel, would they absorb by the community? Do they see themselves as Israeli, or do they carry the identity from the countries that they came from, and try to keep that alive?
Well, first, just to make it clear, perhaps some people would like to go back, as this lady mentioned, but it's simply not safe. I mean, as a dream, as a fantasy, as nostalgia, that's one thing, but in practical terms, you cannot go back. It's not safe. And to your second question, obviously, an immigrant always takes something from the country where he was born, the language, the house, the street, the place, the food, music, right? So obviously, these people have a certain heritage. And by the way, when we speak about Arab lands, Morocco is very different from Yemen, even in the sense of how people look, what they eat, what kind of music they listen to. So it's like saying that Russia and Italy and Spain and England is the same. No, it's not, right? So obviously, each of these communities brought with them to Israel a sense of being an Iraqi Jew, a sense of being a Moroccan Jew. But I think that most of them, all of them, I would say, feel Israelis with a certain background, with a certain heritage. Their family comes from that and that. And as generations go by, the sense of being Israeli becomes stronger and stronger. So if you go back to the 50s or the 60s, you would find people who speak a certain dialect. You would hear in their Hebrew. You would listen to certain sounds that you would say, "Oh, he's certainly coming from Yemen," or from something like that. But the second generation, the third generation, the fourth generation, and you have intermarriage, for example, between all kinds of Jews coming from Russia, coming from Morocco. So it becomes more and more Israeli, so to speak. And yes, Israel is definitely a melting pot in that sense, just as perhaps similar to the United States, because you have people coming from all corners of the globe, so to speak. So you have Persian and Turkish and Iraqi and Yemeni Jews who are blending with German and Russian and Polish and etc., etc. So I definitely think that they see themselves more as Israel. If you would go now, right, 2018, to an Israeli university and ask people what they are, what's their identity, would certainly say that they're Israeli, but they perhaps would say that my parents or my grandparents came from this and this, and back home we eat this and this food, which is more Iraqi or more. So of course, immigrants bring some of their, life from their country of origin, but they build a new life. And I think in that sense, they're more Israelis today. Okay. Yes?
Displacement on the paper that was handed out. I see estimated in 2012, there's just a handful of Jews in so many of the different countries. Why would they want to stay? And isn't there an ever situation of security?
Well, the people who are there, so for example in Iraq, in Egypt, these Jews are in their 80s or their 90s, some of them not in a good health, blind, in very not good conditions, so they will not start a new life in Israel. They will die in Egypt. But that's it. I mean, as just Henry said, there are 3 Jews in Iraq. They're very old, and they're not going to leave Iraq. I don't think they have any problem. Again, when you have a Jew who's 95-year-old and he's blind, he's not a real threat to anyone, so you can simply let him die there. So, yeah.
There was a case in Afghanistan. There were 2 Jews in Afghanistan. They were living like 50 meters from one another. They weren't talking to one another for 20 years. And because of the issue, no one remembered why. So.
But that's more of a Jewish story than a Middle Eastern. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Was a diplomatic what? How did they land? It was a Jewish community in Afghanistan. It was originally from Iran.
There were Jews in the entire area of Central Asia. In their orientation, they're more of Persian Jews, like their food, their languages, etc. Most of them, again, left these areas, but you still have some Jews. In Bukhara, you had a very big community, but these communities left as well. So nowadays you have just a handful, as we mentioned.
One of them passed away a few years ago when it was a diplomatic mission to bring his family to Israel. His family was in Israel. He refused. So
Okay, thank you for listening, and good evening.
So I want to thank Adi for coming from Israel. He arrived actually 2 days ago, 1 day ago, so I don't even know how he's still standing. And I want to thank the consulate for making this event happen. And I want to say how important Sephardi Voices is, given this kind of conversation of the Q&A. Because what Adi was really talking about at the end was that, just like in the United States, people who came here as immigrants, there were 2 million Jews who came before, say, World War I. And what happens is it's, 60, 100 years later, and you have generations, and you have multiculturalism, and you change. That's what's happened in Israel. But this is the last generation to get those stories. Because the person who came in 1950, let's say, from Iraq, who was 20 years old, today is 88. So if you don't get the story now, it's finished. It's like a Holocaust survivor. 1945, 1930, 15, that person would be 88 today, same thing. But Spielberg got 52,000 stories. We have so far 451 in Sephardi Voices. So if you know people, if you haven't told a story, then please let us know who you are so we can get your story. Because what Adi was saying, the student at university who might have Defina, or couscous, or whatever it is, in terms of the food or the music, they also want to know that history and that story. And we have an opportunity to expand and nourish them. So please share and let us know, and thank you again for coming.